Hello there, students. Thank you for being part of this presentation today. My name is Luis Silva. I am your social studies teacher, and our focus for today is the progressive movement 1890 to 1912. The progressive movement. Why was there a progressive movement? Well, industrialization, urbanization, and immigration created significant changes and challenges for the United States. What was the government supposed to do? Well, the government was supposed to use its power to regulate and improve society. It was in a way a rejection of laissez-faire ideology which said that the government should not interfere in the economy. This was not a radical movement because it rejected ideas such as socialism and basically was saving and improving capitalism. Who was involved in this movement? Many of the progressive era reformers were middle class men as well as women, but the group itself was very diverse and it included Protestant church leaders demanding temperance, politicians regulating monopolies and trusts, union leaders addressing workers' rights, women demanding right to vote, African Americans demanding greater equality. And by the way, if you are taking the AP exam, you need to compare the progressive movement to other reform periods such as Age of Jackson, the populist movement, and the New Deal. Promoting reform, the muckrakers. The muckrakers attempted to expose problems in American society. They were a group of people who were looking out for the overall well-being of the nation. They were basically writers, journalists who brought out the problems in America. They were nicknamed muckrakers by Theodore Roosevelt, and he did not mean it in a pleasant way. Some of the important examples are Ida Tarbell, which wrote History of Standard Oil Company, published in McClure's magazine in 1902, in which she exposed a whole bunch of the problems with the Standard Oil Company. Another one is Jacob Riis. He wrote How the Other Half Lives, exposed the horrors of life in the slums of New York in 1890. Another one is Lincoln Steffens, wrote The Shame of the Cities in 1904 and exposed corruption in city politics, in this case referring to political machines. And lastly, you have Upton Sinclair in The Jungle, which we're going to talk later on about it. The role of women in the progressive movement. Women played an important role in the progressive movement as they basically broke down the idea of separate spheres. As you may recall, females were actually told that they had to stay at home, they were supposed to take care of children, but females wanted a bigger role in life, bigger role in society, and they were fighting for that. Some of the ideas or organizations that became part because females started to become more proactive is the National Child Labor Committee, which fought for laws banning child labor. Another big organization that was formed is the National Consumers League, which headed by Florence Kelley advocated for the rights of women in the workplace and the laws against child labor, among other things that would benefit society. And this was actually or became part in the Mueller versus Oregon case in 1908, in which the court ruled that laws prohibiting women workers and restricting women to 10 hours a day were constitutional. One of the big events that took place in 1911 was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which led to the death of 146 workers, mostly females and immigrants. And this actually brought to the national attention the need to practice basically a safe work environment for everybody. And this brought a whole bunch of people trying to change the way that America was doing business. Urban reform. As you may know, throughout the Industrial Revolution, there was a big movement of people from the farm life into city life, and this created a whole bunch of problems such as urban poverty, political corruption, as well as alcoholism. Jane Addams and Florence Kelley basically fought for better housing conditions for females as well as immigrants in the cities. There were demands to take away power from political bosses by taking public utilities out of private companies' hands And examples: place gas lines, water systems, transportation systems, among other things, under public control. Municipal government reforms such as voters electing heads of city departments, such as fire department, police department, and sanitation became a big deal because people wanted those institutions to be more involved with the city, with the people of the city, and not necessarily controlled by a few politicians that could do anything they wanted to. State reforms. Many progressive governors fought against corporation control of state politics. One of the big names out there is Robert Lafayette. He was from Wisconsin, and he basically pioneered many reforms in the state of Wisconsin. Some of those reforms included regulate public utilities, take on the powerful railroad industry, adopt tax reforms that would benefit people, and the political reforms. The important thing here is that Robert Lafayette brought this problem to the forefront, and many states actually began to work on all of these ideas in order to bring changes to the states. Political reform. Political reformers wanted to increase democracy and reduce the control of trust. And in order to do this, something had to be done. So these are some of the measures that were actually done in order to prevent people, outsiders, from controlling politics. And the first thing that we have is the Australian or secret ballot, which allow voters to mark their choice for office secretly. Another one is direct primary, the nomination of candidates placed into the hands of the voters instead of, political machines. Recall. This meant that elected politicians could be removed from office by the voters before their term expired. Also, the initiative, in which voters could introduce laws. Referendum. Voters could directly vote on a law. And one of the most biggest changes of all was the 17th Amendment, which basically, rather than the state legislature, voters could actually vote for the United States senators. Prior to the 17th Amendment, it was actually the state legislatures who actually voted for the senators. But in this case, the power was taken away from the legislators and it was given to the people. By the way, the Populist Party had previously advocated for the 17th Amendment or this particular change, and up to a certain degree they were ignored, but it did pass eventually. The Temperance movement. The Temperance movement was really important because it actually brought the issue of drinking to the forefront. And the people who were against prohibition were called wet, and the people that supported prohibition were called dry. Now, there were conflicts between Protestant native born versus Catholic immigrants, for the most part, because Catholic immigrants tended to not see, drinking as a very bad thing. So there were like conflicts, tensions between these two groups. Also, there were conflicts, disagreements between rural people as well as urban people, because rural people believe that, something had to be done to restrict people from drinking, while urban people, they're like, well, there's nothing really wrong with people having a drink here and there. Now, because of all of this, many things or many institutions or organizations came to be. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was a large organization of women advocating for temperance. Rightfully so, females were heavily involved in the progressive movement. They wanted to bring change to society. They wanted to make society a better place for everybody. Now, the Anti-Saloon League, 1895, was a leading organization advocating for legal prohibition. So they didn't want just a promise of, hey, I will not drink, but they wanted the government to act and say, you cannot drink. And as a result, in 1919, you had the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which basically prohibited drinking. Theodore Roosevelt, very big in the progressive area. Roosevelt believed in an enlarged role for the president. Examples in change of labor relations. Prior to Roosevelt, McKinley, in 1877, Cleveland in 1894 had sided with corporations, but Theodore Roosevelt was different. In the coal miners' strike of 1902, he basically attempted to mediate, and resolve the dispute between the workers and the bosses. And what happened is that the owners did not want to compromise with, the people, their workers. So Theodore Roosevelt told them, hey, if you do not come to an agreement, I'm going to take over the mine and I will send over federal troops. So he forced people, in this case, the owners of the coal mine company, to basically compromise with the workers. This was a big step, unlike previous presidents who basically had sided with the owners of big corporations. Roosevelt proposes a series of progressive reforms known as the Square Deal. Some people call them the 3Cs. And basically, this is what it says. Corporations, in this case, control of corporations. 2, consumers, consumer protection. And 3, conservation of the environment and its natural resources. Corporations, trustbusting. As you may know by now, the Sherman Antitrust Act was very ineffective at reducing the power of corporations. Theodore Roosevelt realized this and he broke up the Northern Securities Company, railroad monopoly, and his decision was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1904. Roosevelt would be known for trust busting. Theodore Roosevelt distinguished between good and bad trusts. He knew that there were good people out there who were basically efficient and had lower prices, and those bad people out there, or bad companies, which hurt consumers and stifle competition. Theodore Roosevelt sought to increase the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission in order to make or provide people and help people with interstate commerce. And the Elkins Act was passed in 1903, which increased penalties for rate rebates. Then finally, in 1906, the Hipbird Act was passed, which gave the ICC the power to set maximum rates for railroads. Consumer protection. Relatively new protection for consumers, basically, because remember, prior to this, consumers basically were not protected. People or companies would give like bad things, bad products to people, and consumers couldn't do anything. The Upton Sinclair writings of the Jungle was very important, and it brought many changes. The idea behind the Upton Sinclair writing the Jungle was intended basically to increase support for socialism and workers' rights, but actually it didn't increase support for socialism, but it actually brought to the forefront a big problem in the meat industry. So because of Upton Sinclair book, The Jungle, TR was actually forced to come up and provide protections for consumers. Now the public focuses on the insanity nature of the meat industry was a direct result of Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. And obviously this put a whole bunch of pressure in TR because TR had to act and protect the consumer. Because of this, we had the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. The federal government would regulate and inspect the meat industry very closely. Also, Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 created the FDA and protected the public against the manufacture, sale, and transportation of mislabeled foods and drugs. Conservation, the third C for Theodore Roosevelt. The issue of conservation did not register yet as a national issue. The Sierra Club had been advocating for the environment. Theodore Roosevelt used the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 to protect 150 million acres of land. The New Lands Reclamation Act of 1902 said that money from the sale of public lands could be used for irrigation projects in the West. The topic of conservation was Roosevelt's most long-lasting domestic achievements, as he is still remembered up to this point for what he did for the environment. William Howard Taft became the president after Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore actually said that he was going to honor the president of George Washington and not seek a third term in office in 1908. So Mr. Howard, or William Howard Taft, became the candidate, and he actually became the president of the United States. He basically continued TR's progressive policies, and he actually broke up more trust than Roosevelt himself. He continued conservationist policies, but he did actually change, the policy of Theodore Roosevelt, or the big stick policy, but instead he actually adopted the policy of dollar diplomacy, which encouraged businesses to invest money in areas of strategic concerns to the United States. By the way, TR, or Teddy Roosevelt, came back in 1912 in order to run again for president. Now we have reached the end of this presentation. Do not forget to subscribe. Please make sure, if you need more help, to ask your questions at the bottom on the comment section. And this is the end. I will see you soon.